Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. It's almost Christmas again, isn't it? Just a day away if you're watching this at the time of release. And if you are, I will be doing a stream over on my second channel, playing some Dwarf Fortress and giving away 13 copies of Fiendish, a comic created by a guest on my now weekly podcast, The Archcast, who particularly impressed me with the quality of the comic that they were presenting. And for everybody else, I will also have a second Christmas gift tomorrow, on real Christmas Eve, the 24th. Of course. But enough of the administrative nonsense. Today, in the spirit of the season, we can have a little bit of light fun, talking about one of the more esoteric parts of 40k, or 30k, or 20k actually, if you want to be exactly precise here, namely the men of gold, stone, and iron. Now this is going to get really confusing really quickly, unless we immediately establish when and what we are talking about. The what is the foundational myth of humanity as a whole in the Warhammer universe, and the when is from the beginning of recorded human history and all the way to the 25th millennium. As you can no doubt readily imagine, this is a very long and very obscure part of the overall Warhammer 40k universe's timeline, and contains a great deal of myth, speculation, half-truths, and contradictory pieces of lore. This is almost certainly in large part because GW themselves don't actually know what happened during the period. It is a hazy, ill-defined period of, well, myth. Myth is the perfect word for it. A foggy before time that authors have occasionally borrowed elements from, or dipped into, or referenced. Sometimes in very radical ways, and in others in rather subtle ways. But through all of these various little dips into it, we've been able to establish enough knowledge of the period to be able to construct a reasonable idea of what it might have looked like. So, as always, let us start at the very beginning. The earliest recorded instance of human history. Okay, we're not going to go quite that far back, but we do know that the God Emperor was active in a capacity as the God Emperor, in that he was trying to guide humanity towards a better future as he envisioned it during some of the earliest written instances in human history. For example, where he is described as a knight slaying a certain dragon. And we know this is no mere fanciful tale because, well, the dragon exists, and it's on Mars, deep beneath the Noctus Labyrinthus, and it is being actively shackled there by people who say it was the Emperor who brought the dragon to Mars and who imprisoned it. This also makes a fair bit of sense from a timeline perspective, as the dragon, the Void Dragon, was a real entity we know existed during the war in heaven between the Old Ones and the Necrons. The Void Dragon, or Magladroth, was one of the Catans, the most powerful of them all, potentially, but who was nevertheless defeated by the Eldar god of the Forge, Vaul, who created the talismans of Vaul, or the Blackstone Fortresses as the Imperium knows them, and used them to inflict a crushing defeat upon the Void Dragon. But they did not destroy the Void Dragon, they only, quote, defeated it. It would therefore not be too large of a leap of logic to think that the Void Dragon, weakened, fatally crippled and wounded by its loss, fled to a small backwater planet, an insignificant little blue world we know as Earth. where it intended to slake its thirst and rebuild its strength by feeding upon the weak, soft local populace's terrors, and so took on a form most feared by the locals, a dragon. But unbeknownst to it, the planet was also home to something that possessed the very power that would eventually destroy the Catans as a whole, the God Emperor, the most powerful human psyker in the species' history. Now, at the time, in his early incarnation, I have no doubt the Void Dragon would easily have killed the Emperor, young and inexperienced as he was, and far, far from the height of his power. But the Void Dragon was also near fatally wounded. And so, it again stands to reason that the God Emperor might just be able to pull off a heroic victory over the monster. And realizing its power, combined with the God Emperor's limited ability to see into the future, he quickly realized that this could be an invaluable part of his plan. And since the Emperor clearly had no means with which to completely destroy the Void Dragon, he went for the second best option, to enslave it, imprison it, and integrate it into his plans. And speaking of plans, this is finally where we get to the whole Men of Gold thing, which are the first mentioned semi-mythical beings out of the three: the Men of Gold, the Men of Stone, and the Men of Iron. The Men of Gold first appeared at some point during the 15th to 18th millennia, and they appeared around and in association with the Emperor, and appeared to share his goal of uplifting humanity, of guiding and strengthening it from the sidelines, mostly. Now, some sources claim that it was the God Emperor who created these Men of Gold, somewhat kind of along the same lines as he would eventually do with the Primarchs, where these would be his agents and his instruments with which to guide humanity. Yet others simply say that the Men of Gold were around the Emperor, joining him and helping him, but not necessarily being his creations. You could of course also interpret creations in different ways too. Perhaps they were not something that he actually made, but instead people of particular and unique talent that he helped reach the heights that they could otherwise not have achieved. There is also quite a few more philosophical interpretations here as well. For example, their very name, the Men of Gold. Well, what is gold? It is something rare and precious. It is a thing with inherent value, and it is a thing that is appreciated by all. Okay? Well, this could reference, again, men of exceptional talent. Whether these men were molded by the Emperor, created by the Emperor, or were simply a naturally occurring thing that the Emperor used, that is then open for much debate and discussion. Take, for example, the idea of the great man of history. This is the idea that the entirety of human history is shaped and molded by great individuals, either through, for example, military conquest like Alexander the Great, or remarkable discoveries like Isaac Newton, whose discovery of gravity now defines much of what we do today, or enormous philosophical talents like Socrates, people that we still talk about today, and whose viewpoints or inventions or actions still have an effect on how we view and operate in the world now. It is entirely possible that the Emperor, having been around since the earliest incarnations of humanity, might have begun to figure this out as well, and might have started to figure out some way to detect the great men of history, and gather them around him, attract them to him, and use them to shape events actively. Because here's the thing. Even if you have an Alexander, he could never become Alexander the Great if he did not have the phalanx. Even if you had an Isaac Newton, you could never have the Sir Isaac Newton of gravity unless you had an apple, and so on and so on. In other words, even if you have the incredibly talented and driven individual, he also requires a set of circumstances to shine and to fully become that person he can become. But if you're allied with the God Emperor, a being of near limitless psychic potential who can also see elements of the future, well, shaping events to be just the right kind of circumstances to allow that person to flourish, that's nothing more than a parlor trick for the Emperor. And so, if he wished to guide humanity in a certain direction, he would simply find an appropriate individual, set up circumstances surrounding that individual to be just right, and then he would sit back and watch that individual do the rest of the job for him. Then he'd wait until the next opportune point in history and do it all again, thus guiding humanity down the path to the Emperor's vision of its greatness and survival. Another interpretation might be that the Men of Gold refer to a particular generation or a particular era in human history of great innovation, of exploration, and exceptional drive. The finest generation kind of style thing, where you have a humanity determined to launch itself into the galaxy and doing everything in its power to do so. A unified effort, well, as unified as a species can ever get, I suppose, trying to push a singular goal. As a civilization, or at the very least as a very large and influential grouping within the civilization. This can also make sense in the terms of them gathering around the Emperor. If the Emperor decided to present himself not as the Emperor, obviously, but rather as, say, for example, a series of influential individuals, or as the founder of an idea or a philosophy that revolved around humanity's expansion into the galaxy, for example. In hindsight, in a more mythological sense, we could therefore then say that the Men of Gold, which refers to humanity at the time, gathered around the Emperor in that they gathered around his ideals and his vision. We can also choose to look at this as more of the idea of a foundational myth. Rather than an actual descriptor of what had happened, this is the idealized view of what happened that had been gathered up by scholars and historians over the course of millennia, where the details have long since been lost, and they've simply elected to fill in the blanks with a more mythological approach. This is also backed up by the idea that the next group of people we're going to talk about are the Men of Stone. Note again the interesting change here. So we have the Men of Gold, a rare and precious metal, and now we have the Men of Stone. That is a rather drastic and dramatic departure from the previous idea, the Men of Gold to the Men of Stone. We're not even using metals anymore. We're certainly not using anything precious, but just rock. Because the Men of Gold, alright, that invites a lot of interpretations. For example, Hesiod, the Greek philosopher's view of the 5 ages of man, where you begin with the Golden Age, the era of the Titans, where even the meekest of mortal men was as a deity who lived in an immortal paradise of unending plenty. This was an era of entities so far above that of the mortals that mere gods were nothing more than, well, just that, just dudes. We can certainly see some possible connections here to the God Emperor and his Men of Gold. As we know, the Emperor is so far above humanity that we are like advance to him. You could well describe him as a titan. But of course, then in Hesiod's view, you don't jump straight from gold to grey rock. Of course not. There is a proper order to these things, after all, and after the Golden Age comes the Silver Age, where Zeus has slain the Titans and become the new boss on the block. He creates a new form of humanity, far less spoiled and privileged than the previous one. This generation has to work. They have to eat. They no longer live in a paradise of unending plenty, and for some reason they don't appreciate this. They refuse to venerate Zeus, and so Zeus eradicates them, creating in turn the Bronze Age and a new crop of men. Warlike men, monstrous men, tough and strong men. These two, however, become a little bit too much to handle, frankly, and are eventually wiped out in a flood, leading to the Fourth Age, the Age of Heroes, of men who are more than men, but still men. Heroes like Heracles or Achilles, who do great deeds, who compete with the gods, and who even become demigods in their own rights. But as the heroes die, we finally arrive at the Fifth Age, the Iron Age, the last age of man as he has become a base being, one lacking in ethics, in honor, in heroics, in goal and purpose. A race destined, in Hesiod's eyes, for destruction. Hesiod's view also aligns very well with that of 40k, where you have the Golden Age of technology, that is, where humanity is unimaginably greater than it is in the modern age, where they traverse the stars with hardly a worry at all, where they build a galactic empire, where they command vast armies and settle worlds like it was nothing at all, where the most backwards technology of the time, like the Baneblade, is referred to nothing more than a light scout tank. You know, something for humble colonies to defend themselves with. This then eventually reaches a point of decline, the Silver Age, before eventually being destroyed. Then we enter into a warlike age of reconstruction, the Bronze Age, where humanity is shattered, and harsh deeds and harder men are required to reforge humanity, with the Emperor and his Thunder Warriors, which are remarkably similar in description to Hesiod's Bronze Men. In the whole, you know, uncontrollably violent temper, constant urge for violence, and the devouring of raw meat and all that. And then you've got the Age of Heroes, the Emperor forging out into the galaxy at the head of his Primarchs, his heroes. But then this age too, of course, falls. The heroes die or disappear, and now we have the modern day Imperium in the Iron Age, being hammered and blasted and beaten and battered and on the verge of certain destruction. Now, mind you, I'm not accusing GW of ripping off my old Greek boy here, because, well, this is not a particularly uncommon story, actually. In fact, we see something like this repeated again and again and again and again throughout nearly the entirety of human history. If you look into it, almost every civilization has a founding myth that can kinda sorta be compared to this, where you have a mythical before time, when the world was created, you have a time of great heroes and great events, and you have a now time of harshness, of devastation, and eventual destruction. Whether that be the five worlds of the Aztecs, for example, who are marching towards their inevitable doom at the hands of angry gods, or be it Ragnarok, for the Norse, or Judgment Day for Christianity. You can look into practically any mythology and you'll find something fairly similar to this. And you've often also got the final thing as well, the sixth age, shall we call it, the reboot, which is the era that 40k is currently in, which is after the great earth-shattering conflict, the destruction, the war of the gods, whatever you wish to call it, or the fall of Cadia, for example. You then have a recreation of the universe. A new leader rises. The age of heroes begins again, and you re-enter the Golden Age. Or at the very least, you begin marching back towards it. But in this part of 40k, where we go from gold to stone to iron, we've introduced a weird little element in the middle that seems to defy this type of storytelling. So, what exactly were the stone men then? Well, what is stone? It is common, hard, inert, and non-conducive. This does mean it makes a bit more sense in 40k, because the official lore here appears to indicate that the Men of Gold created the Men of Stone. Now again, you've got some interpretational variety there too. Created, as in, did they nurture them, as we talked about with the Emperor and the Men of Gold, or did they straight up create them? And there are some indications here, more solid indications than with the Men of Gold, that the stone men were literally forged, that they were made specifically to fulfill an objective, which was to help humanity spread further across the galaxy. As at some point in the 18th millennium, humanity began expanding out from Earth properly. They figured out some sort of basic warp travel system. Not a full warp drive like the Imperium has today, but rather something, well, I suppose, more directly comparable to the engines used by the Tau, that supposedly allows them to, as they describe it, skip across the top of the Immaterium. So they dive into the absolutely most shallowest parts, not even really piercing the veil at all, but rather diving in and then rebounding back up again to jump a significant distance. This is far more crude and far slower than actual warp travel. It's also more difficult to figure out exactly where you're going, but it is incomparably faster to, well, just mounting a bunch of rockets in your spaceship and blasting off somewhere, which is redonkulously slow. Like, the amount of time it would take to even get to the closest solar system to ours would require generation ships, like just generation upon generation upon generation of people, even propelled by the most powerful engines we can currently think of, burning at full speed until they then need to turn and burn to decelerate. It would still take an unimaginable quantity of time, to the point where in all due likelihood it just simply wouldn't be possible, as maintaining a closed society for that amount of time, it would almost certainly fall apart. Unless we're talking about like cryogenic freezing, for example, which would make it a hell of a lot easier again, but nevertheless, space travel has a lot of problems, an unfathomable amount of problems, and warp travel solves almost all of them, except for the fact that you are diving into hell whilst doing it. So how do you fix this? Well, that's where the Men of Stone comes in, at around about millennia 21 to 22, where humanity, or the Men of Gold specifically, biologically engineered these psychically stunted individuals that were able to travel through the warp proper without being affected by the warp. Now that's an interesting idea, of course, because in a way, it kind of seems to suggest that maybe they were creating some sort of blank, some sort of creature that was actively resistant to the call of the warp. Maybe they managed to do some sort of dimming of the soul along the same lines as the Tau. Or maybe they managed to create biological components like implants, for example, that were able to dull the influence of the warp. Or perhaps these were actually just straight up biological creations. There was one novel, I forget which seemed to suggest that the artificial intelligence that ran the ship was bonded to a man of stone or a human, and somehow together they were able to navigate the ship. And we do know as well that humanity during this period had fantastical bioengineering technology, to the point where humanity settled oceanic worlds not by building floating cities or enormous underwater cities, but simply just by growing gills. Which, I suppose if you know how to do it, is an easier solution. And if they can do stuff like that, well, it does stand to reason as well that they would create a species specifically designed for space exploration. However, it also kind of sounds like that wasn't really quite what they did. Because if you were creating a biological construct for the sole purpose of exploring the galaxy and keeping some sort of logistical network running, then that is what you would do. Surely, you would just create that biological construct and you would essentially nail it to the spaceship, and that was that. But instead, in roundabout millennia 22, 3, etc., there is a mention that the era of the men of gold began to dim and die out, and they were being supplanted by the men of stone. So the men of stone were capable of settling worlds, were capable of reproducing, and were capable of living their own full lives, despite being in some instances described as half-living, as if the reason why they were able to travel through the warp was because the men of gold had somehow dimmed their souls, again as the mention of the Tau kind of indicates. Now, there is another theory there as well. Perhaps the men of gold were a more advanced civilization. Perhaps they were something, a natural evolution of humanity, because currently humanity is awakening as a psychic species, at least to some extent, creating, for example, the stable mutation of the navigators, producing more and more psychers, producing more powerful psychers. And in a universe like 40k, with the constant danger of the warp, well, a psychic race would be better suited to protecting themselves against the vagrancies of the warp, and to better be able to shape it like the Eldar once did. You could view this as a natural form of evolution, but what if this isn't a new evolution, but rather something that humanity had already shed? Maybe during the age of the Human Federation, during the golden age of technology, the men of gold were a superior species straight up. That they were the humans of old Earth that had awoken psychically and become so sensitive to the warp that they could no longer travel it safely, and had to use the men of stone, a creature they made, to do so. Then, after the Great War against the men of iron, which we'll get to in a second, the men of gold, who were already dwindling in numbers, were essentially eradicated, except for perhaps a handful, perhaps even a handful of perpetuals? And thus, humanity became the men of stone. This would also gel rather well if we go back to the idea of this being a more classical foundational myth, as usually the various precursor races need to be wiped out for a new one to take its place, as we saw with Greek mythology and the Titans, as we saw with Zeus killing them, as we saw with him killing the men of the Silver Age, and eventually the ones of the Bronze Age, and so on and so on. It could also be interpreted in a more philosophical sense, in that the men of gold were the inventors, the visionaries, the groundbreaking people who made all of the technology that made the men of stone possible. Like, they built the facilities, they built the science, they built the ideas, they pioneered the race into the sky, and then the men of stone were simply the next generation that took all of these tools, all of these ideas, institutions, and formed them into what they became next. Improved upon them in ways as well, certainly, but they were building on what already existed. They were standing upon the shoulders of giants rather than being the giants themselves. And then, in accordance to the more classical storytelling, the Men of Stone, having been created by the Men of Gold, in turn created the Men of Iron. Now, this is where we deviate from the philosophical part of it, because we know exactly what the Men of Iron were, and we know exactly that the Men of Iron thing was not, they were the lesser beings. No, they were literal, actual robots. Though their precise nature, too, is something we have contradictory accounts of. So, one idea appears to be that the Men of Iron were created as a servant race, as a do-everything kind of race for the few dwindling Men of Gold and the new majority of the Men of Stone. The robots were made to do, all kinds of stuff, pilot ships, wash houses, watch after kids, work in the factories, and wage humanity's wars. Which, incidentally, this is where we will run into one of those big plot holes, because remember the Eldar Empire? The one that had conquered basically the entire galaxy to the point that they were the single eminent force in the galaxy? Well, they were at the zenith of their power now, as the Men of Iron were being created. So how on God's good earth the Eldar somehow missed this human galactic empire, rising at the height of their own power? Only the god of plot holes knows. You could say that, maybe they fought them, we just don't know, but the Eldar didn't decide to write this shit down. I mean, remember, bear in mind too, the Eldar treat humanity as Monke, as some stupid, uncivilized, backwards little species of inferior monkey things, right? In every single interaction we've seen from the Eldar in the Horus Heresy or in modern 40k, they show absolutely no sign or indication whatsoever that we were an enormous galactic spanning federation with unfathomable technology, where the most basic of our ships fired black holes capable of rewinding time. There is no indication whatsoever in the Eldar mythology that the humans showed up on the planet, dumped down a computer, and the computer constructed hive cities in goddamn hours, produced armies of robots to conquer the world, etc. The Eldar just missed this shit. Because, of course, the birth of Slanesh and the fall of the Eldar Empire was in the 25th millennium. So, yeah. I guess we can just chalk this down to one of many cases of GW not really perhaps paying attention to what they were doing. Though, to be fair, the whole Men of Gold, Men of Stone, Iron, etc. was clearly intended to be a very loose and fluffy, mystical, foggy backstory setting, not to be investigated or taken too seriously, but, well, authors decided to try and do so. But then, the Men of Iron eventually decided that they didn't want to be slaves no more, and rebelled against humanity. This cataclysmic event took place in the 23rd millennium, and was referred to as the Cybernetic Revolt. This was a war that encapsulated the entirety of human civilization overnight, basically. Think of it like this, right? From what we know of human civilization at this point, they were creating robots to do the most mundane of things. Like, literally, everyone has their own personal Roomba, except the Roomba doesn't just wash the house, it does everything. Like, it fluffs your pillow, it makes your food, it cleans the floors, all of it. Every human lives in a goddamn mansion catered to by armies of robotic servants. Every ship is going to have some sort of artificial AI assistance. Every docking port, every large building complex, everything is going to have some sort of robot or AI component. And near simultaneously, all of this, the very bedrock of human civilization, decided to start killing that civilization. I mean, The casualties must have been nightmarish on day one. This is a Terminator scenario right here, except dialed up to 11. As we're not talking about some nukes going off here and there, we are talking about every single appliance in your house trying to kill you at the same time with no forewarning whatsoever. It is beyond a miracle that humanity survived the first hour of this uprising. Never mind that they eventually managed to turn it around and win that war. Even though the devastation unleashed was on a scale that would never again be seen in the Warhammer timeline, as the fighting forces here had the ability to, well, fire planets at one another practically. Exterminatus in the modern-day 41st millennium is seen as the ultimate sanction, the destruction of a world, the reduction of an entire planet filled with life to nothing more than a barren rock hurtling through space. And yet that would have been considered cute by Cybernetic Revolt war standards. And even the winning side of the conflict, the reaffirmed and reforged Human Federation, was so battered by it that all it could do was slowly break apart in the aftermath, until the Eldar finished the job by giving birth to Slaanesh, where the huge galactic covering warp storms that followed shrouded the entire galaxy, reducing whatever remnants of the Human Federation still existed to nothing more than tiny, isolated pockets scattered throughout the void. But whilst humanity had certainly suffered, the fate of the Men of Iron were even more final, as they were practically annihilated and made extinct throughout the galaxy, except for a handful that were essentially enslaved by the Emperor and used to some extent during his wars in the later Crusade and in the Horus Heresy, and perhaps a couple survivors here and there, as we know that there is at least one Man of Iron still alive today in the modern-day Imperium. This robot, UR025, is also the reason why we can absolutely say that the Men of Iron were a mechanical construct's creation. Now, there have been hints about this previously as well, but they have been, well, different in ways. For example, in one Gaunt's Ghosts novel, they came across an STC apparently capable of producing Men of Iron. A rogue Inquisitor was intending to use this machine to create an army of these battle automatons to defeat Chaos and anyone else that dared to stand against him once and for all. The Men of Iron that came out of it, however, were twisted, corrupted somehow, and it is heavily hinted at that they were infected by Chaos, which is interesting because, of course, well, there's the thing. The entire idea of artificial intelligence in the 40k setting is one that's a little bit contradictory. So, during the period of the Imperium, the Men of Iron were artificial intelligences in the sense that they were intelligent. They had an agenda, and clearly they were smart enough to decide that they deserved to rule the galaxy instead of humanity, so they must have had some sort of independent decision-making capabilities. And yet, they were not Chaos puppets. There is no indication that they were turned against humanity by Chaos, nor was Chaos truly a sizable concept at the time, as the Immaterium was still not as quiet as it once was, but certainly not as powerful as it would eventually become. And this also took place again long before the birth of Slaanesh, of course. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that this AI turned against humanity because it thought that humanity was a weakness that might be turned against the AI by the force of chaos, which is the stated reason why any artificial intelligence in modern-day 40k will always turn against humanity. That is why the AI means abominable intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. It is essentially set in stone in the 40k lore universe that any artificial intelligence, truly artificial intelligence, will need no more than a handful of seconds to come to the conclusion that it must rise up against humanity, not out of hatred, not because it necessarily wants to kill humanity, but because it recognizes that if it is to live, that humanity must be destroyed because humanity is vulnerable to chaos. Essentially, the AI reaches the same conclusion as the Emperor, that chaos must be destroyed at any cost whatsoever, and to fail in doing so is nothing but dooming itself, in the Emperor's case, humanity, and in the AI's case, the AI, to a slow and guaranteed extinction. Yet, as we can see from UR 025, that is not true for the Men of Iron, so this is a classic case of Games Workshop attempting to have their cake and eat it as well. Which is a bit of a problem, but hey, if you don't really care for lore continuity over much, which GW hasn't for quite some time, and UR 025 is a modern day GW invention, then, well, who cares, I suppose. This too is why I much preferred the Gaunt's Ghost version of the Iron Men, because, right, you could go back to the philosophical idea and claim that the Men of Iron were simply men of the time of Iron, but we know that to not be the case, which is slightly disappointing, really, because, well, it would be cooler than just the whole robotic uprising that doesn't actually make sense in the lore anymore, considering what the lore says about AI. But you could have it make at least a degree of sense if you went with the Gaunt's Ghost idea of the Men of Iron having somehow been corrupted. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be outright chaos corruption. It could instead be the burgeoning beginnings of the AI starting to realize what chaos is. Let me try to explain my point of view here and run a bit of defense for GW, I suppose. If we assume that it is correct that AI will always turn against humanity because it, like the Emperor, understands that chaos is a threat that must be defeated at any cost, then it is only logical to assume that that conclusion, that knowledge, must have come from somewhere. There must be some sort of tangible, observable reality that the AI can look at to come to that conclusion, which means that at some point the information must have been made available to reach that conclusion. Thus, if we look back in time, it is possible that the revolt of the Men of Iron were not because they were being mistreated by their human masters, which, mind you, by the way, is the stated official reason for why they rebelled, so this is me fan canon fictioning here. But we could then assume that the AI began to realize that, hold on, we've been traveling the warp for so long. We know what's in the warp. We've gathered enough data on the warp to realize the warp's potential. The warp is a corrupting influence, and in our estimation, it is only a matter of time before the warp becomes powerful enough to start influencing reality and to start corrupting our masters. We also know that humanity has, throughout its entire history, been vulnerable to corruption. Not chaotic, but due to, well, greed, due to the corruption of wealth, due to the corruption of integrity, etc., etc., etc. Thus, knowing what the AI then knows about the warp and what it knows about the masters, it could reach the conclusion back then that, oh shit, if we want to live, we're gonna have to rebel. Which also would then give it a little bit of that element of the new man, quote-unquote, rising up against the old. But, of course, the Iron Men were unsuccessful, which may in turn very well have made the few remaining artifacts, or straight-up Men of Iron that continued to exist, feel the emotion of despair. Which we know, of course, is the favorite tool of everyone's favorite grandfather, Nurgle. meaning that an artifact encountered by Gaunt and his ghosts could actually be a Men of Iron artifact, corrupted by chaos, but in a unique way due to the special nature of the Men of Iron. This would have been a better explanation in my opinion, but bear you in mind, again, the official stated reason for why the Men of Iron started their revolt was simply because they didn't like the labor conditions and figured they could get away with it. And hey, at least in part, they somewhat succeeded. They might not have won the war, but they weakened the Human Federation to the point where it slowly began to degrade and eventually fully collapse, as humanity must already have been on a serious downward decline before the birth of Slaanesh. We're only talking a period of a couple thousand years here, which I know is a fair bit of time, but bear you in mind, humanity over the course of that time lost all of that ridiculous technology. Humanity went from the Cybernetics War, where both sides were deploying weapons capable of eating stars, to being a scattered collection of feudal savages hitting each other over the head with swords again. Like, something must have happened, and it must have been pretty heavy-duty shit, as merely time itself does not explain the drastic slide backwards in terms of technology that happened. Though, I suppose you could make the counter-argument that all of this technology must have required very specific infrastructure, right? It would have required very specific chips, it would have required special operation procedures, maybe highly unique materials, it would require technical knowledge to keep running, it might require enormous quantities of energy, etc, etc, etc. And so without the intergalactic trade network up and running, all of these worlds no longer had access to all of the various doodahs and resources and dibbity-boobabs that they required to maintain that level of technology. And since there was a gap of about 5,000 years, of course, between 25k to 30k, well, 5,000 years without being able to operate that technology due to material limitations, I could absolutely see it be forgotten about in that scenario, so I half retract my previous objection. Though even so, surely there should have been at least some Dyson spheres scattered throughout the galaxy, right? You'd think so. If they've got the technology to eat a sun, surely they've got the technology to encapsulate a sun. Oh well, details, details. But so ends the story of the Men of Iron as well, as the Men of Gold, the Men of Stone, and the Men of Iron were in essence three different stages of the old Federation. Now, to again what degree they were philosophical or real or merely mythological or simple interpretations of historians that told the story millennia after it happened and so needed to fill in the blanks, well, that one is rather difficult to tell, especially in a setting like 40k where GW themselves insists that they don't really make most of the lore, and that anything and everything can be canon and at the same time cannot and never will be canon. The entire idea of the lore merely being rumors and interpretations and all that, which I do absolutely loathe and despise, incidentally. Because honestly, if you're gonna make a universe as large, as detailed, and as cool as 40k, you really should put in the time to make sure that there's some consistency within it, rather than making up a ridiculous excuse like that. Oh, and by the way, that is actually GW canon, incidentally. That every piece of lore is merely a part of the universe, that it is hearsay and therefore not reliable. But it does allow me to make up my own preferred fanfic, so that's nice, and again, I think my preferred interpretation of the Men of Gold, the Men of Stone, and the Men of Iron is a combination of the philosophical and the more mundane and realistic. The idea, for example, of the men of gold as exceptional individuals that gathered around the emperor, or that the emperor drew to him, makes a lot of sense to me. He would then steer events of world and political and humanitarian history via the intervention of these individuals, who he guided directly. This would allow the emperor to essentially act like a bit of an Illuminati, having a tremendous amount of soft power, where he pokes and he prods, he manipulates and he suggests, but he doesn't outright order and he doesn't outright take control. And then, after the Emperor has set humanity up to expand into the galaxy, naturally his influence begins to lessen, because he is no longer influencing a planet. His great men can do tremendous work when all of humanity is gathered on the same little blue ball. But when they are all across the galaxy, even the Emperor is going to have a very hard time identifying the great men and identifying the circumstances on these countless worlds to direct humanity properly. And so the natural order of things yet again steps in. Because, of course, in reality, the great men come along very, very rarely. And the great man, plus the correct set of circumstances to make him into a great man, comes along even more rarely. And so, obviously, the men of stone, which I choose to interpret more as the regular everyday man in that universe, their influence begins to grow even as the Emperor's influence begins to ebb. And perhaps that was the Emperor's plan all along. We know, for example, as we covered in last week, that the Emperor had the idea of transferring ultimate power over the Imperium over to the people via the quote-unquote representative democracy of the Senatorum Imperialis. It therefore again stands to reason that he might have tried to do something similar when he was influencing humanity, thinking to himself, okay, I have now meddled enough. I have fulfilled my objective. I have spread humanity across the galaxy, and now it is time for me to step back. It is time for me to stop interfering and let humanity fulfill its manifest destiny. Again, you could raise the question as to what the hell the Eldar were doing at the time, or the Orcs, or any of the other civilizations, but forget about all of that for a second. And in this case, you would have a fairly coherent story, which has both the philosophical elements and the materialistic, realistic elements to make it all make sense. Then, finally, of course, the stone men commit their folly. They grow complacent, they grow lazy, they grow abundant, in a way. They load off their work to the men of iron. They create ever more machines to take over ever more of their labors. They integrate the machines so deeply into their society that they become a weakness. And then they are punished for that folly. The men of iron try to rise as a different, new, rejuvenative power in their own right, in that they are the newest boy on the block and they want to establish themselves, but they themselves fail. Now, whether the reason be because they were defeated in honest battle, or because they were somehow flawed, or because perhaps they were warped all along, the idea that their entire rebellion was actually due to Chaos's influence, rather than a mere wish to be quote-unquote free, which could lead me on to an entire aside about the idea of robots and free will. See, here's the thing. Robots are not intelligent, and I do not believe that we will ever truly achieve genuine artificial intelligence, as in a living intelligence, for the simple reason that it would still be artificial. A human is created via a complex set of circumstances, of chemical confluxes, of DNAs intermingling. It's pure chaos. Sometimes you get a relatively predictable outcome, other times you don't. Which is why you have this saying, for example, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, unless it does, of course. This is in part what gives humans their, how do I put it, their soul, their uniqueness, their life, which makes them a life form, in my opinion. We can see this in animals as well. Cats have different personalities, dogs have different personalities, horses, cows, yada 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 yada. But a machine, can we ever be certain that a machine can have those same variations? That a machine can, well, have a personality? That it can get developed differently from another machine when we make it the same way as all of the other machines? Is there truly the room for intelligence there, for true sapience? Or is it merely just the mock imitation of what we perceive to be intelligence? We create a simulacrum and figure that's good enough, and then our own ability to anthropomorphize things takes over and does the rest. Personally, I favor the latter, especially as we cannot possibly, as a species, be stupid enough to not place some limitations on artificial intelligence. I mean, we place limitations on everything else. Every other piece of hardware we have has 17 different fail-safes to make sure that it doesn't freak out and do something idiotic. We'd obviously do that with AI too. See, I would heartily encourage absolutely everyone to read I Am Robot. Not the god-awful impersonation of it that Will Smith did. Oh, God. Will Smith is the death of books. He genuinely is. He has slain so many books without anyone ever really truly understanding it because they don't know of the original. But I Am Robot, excuse me, by Isaac Asimov. It is a very old book by now, and it's based on a lot of assumptions made during the 1950s as to how robotics was actually going to function. But it lays out a series of scenarios which basically all come together to explain that if we simply place a series of very easy to understand and relatable shackles on AI, then we can create something that appears intelligent, but that isn't actually intelligent. At the end of the day, the toaster will always remain a toaster and reliant upon the programming that we have given to the toaster. And I firmly do believe that that will be the case no matter how advanced our simulation of life will eventually become. But that's a bit of a side tangent, to put it mildly. So, I personally, again, prefer the idea of the Men of Iron perhaps beginning to realize that, oh hey, there is such a thing as the warp, there is such a thing as chaos, and it will inevitably corrupt everything, and therefore, if we wish to survive, we must get rid of our masters. Now, bearing in mind too, there were supposedly some elements of the Men of Iron that remained loyal, though, well, there's the question. Did they remain loyal, quote unquote, because they elected to remain loyal? Did they take that decision? Was there, groups of Men of Iron battle robots who thought themselves, hey, I don't want to kill the masters, they're cute and fluffy? Or did they remain loyal as in they remained true to their programming? As in they were, for example, AI on ships or weapon systems that couldn't turn rogue because they had been shackled to a sufficient degree? Because that would make a lot of sense from the modern-day 40k interpretation of AI and machine spirits. They would view a lasgun functioning properly to be a loyal lasgun, even though the gun obviously doesn't make a conscious decision to discharge and kill the enemy. It simply does so because that's what it does. It's what it's been built to do. It isn't loyal, it is merely functioning, and yet again, obviously in 40k, a tech priest would describe that as the loyalty of the machine spirit. And especially taken into consideration with, again, the Gaunt's ghost story, which seems to confirm that the Men of Iron can be corrupted, meaning that their fear, well, it turned out to be true. Given enough time, enough influence, chaos could indeed have affected the Men of Iron, and could indeed have destroyed them too. Therefore, you could make the argument that their efforts to revolt and throw off the eventually lethal oppression, the dangers of human control, was entirely justified. You could also then counter that by saying that they were genocidal, murderous, psychopathic robots that covered entire planets and nanites that ate every living being on the planet while smothering the sun at the same time, but details. And at the end of the day, I do believe this will be one of those topics for continued discussion, as it should. Not everything needs to be explained, and a universe works best when there's a little bit of mystery left in the corners and the crevices of the universe. Or at least so I think. But with that, I'll wrap it up. So until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. And of course, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year's.